Hello, let us resume our discussion on I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King Jr. In my last discussion, I have discussed about the basic introductory part of this particular text. Now let us begin with the text itself. Martin Luther King begins his address, that is, I Have a Dream, with these lines. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. As I've discussed earlier in this particular lecture, that this particular address is very significant regarding the history of America. Now, here, Martin Luther King begins his discussion, his address, with the particular form of happiness. He says, I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. So ultimately, the primary focus of this particular text is centered on some of the important terms, some of the important words that are considered to be important for the history of America. And the first term that is being introduced by him, it is quote unquote freedom. He begins his discussion with a particular reference to the famous Gettysburg Address. He says, 50 years ago. We know that this particular term is actually referring to 20 years. Now, when he says 50 years ago, actually he is indicating to 100 years. So he says 100 years ago, a great American, it is Abraham Lincoln, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today. Fundamentally, we find that whenever we are in a particular kind of a nation, we find that some of the diplomats, some of the freedom fighters, and some of the great politicians who actually paved the way for our progress. And here also you will find that Martin Luther King is actually addressing to one of these persons, and that is Abraham Lincoln. He says, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. I have already mentioned of this particular term, what is Emancipation Proclamation, in my discussion on the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. So if one particular terminology that is considered to be important, that is freedom, then the second one is obviously being associated with the concept of justice. So he says that ultimately the Emancipation Proclamation that actually paved the way for the Negroes regarding the life of freedom, regarding the life of justice, regarding the life of progress. Now, at the present moment when it is, hundreds of years later, here he mentions that this momentous decree came as a great beacon light. You know what is beacon? This particular term is generally being associated with the nautical references. That means when a ship, its beacon actually refers to any particular mark that actually helps a lost ship in tempestuous torments or tempestuous situations in the seas. Now, beacon light, this particular light is actually referring to the light of hope or ray of hope. So here he says, this momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope. So ultimately, it is indicating that the Emancipation Proclamation was the ray of hope for us, the Negro slaves, you see. So when you can identify the terms like niggers, the terms like Negro, and then the slaves, so ultimately you will find a kind of subjugation, a kind of exploitation, a kind of say torture, and different kinds of separations have been, the separatist violence is being pointed out here. So it was a kind of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. So somehow the metaphor of burning, okay, That's by the flames of withering injustice. So everywhere you will find throughout this particular speech, Martin Luther King is indicating towards the particular kind of injustice that is prevailing throughout America during these time periods. And he says that the millions of Negro slaves, they have been, under the different kinds of crises, different kinds of tortures, different kinds of exploitations, to be specific. And this particular Emancipation Proclamation that had been made 100 years ago, it came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. So in a typical symbolic metaphoric language, Martin Luther King is indicating towards that typical form of violence that is prevailing throughout America at the time. He says it came, that is the Emancipation Proclamation, it came as a joyous daybreak because it actually indicated towards some possibility of some positive future. So it was a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. What does the term captivity is actually indicate? Now, whenever there is a matter of captivity, it is actually indicating towards a kind of imprisonment that's prevailing. So everywhere you will find that right to freedom, right to the justice, or maybe the right to leave, all these were completely being negated at the then England, America, to be specific. And you will find that this particular kind of separatist violence was being prevailing in this particular period, just on the basis of this color of skin. Today also you know that in the present day America, the separatism is always existing. Just few days before, we know that there is a kind of a upsurge that have been taken care of by the American government. And that upsurge is due to the differentiation between the skin colors. It is a kind of epidermalization, as you know. Okay, that means a separatism that is being made on the basis of the color of the epidermis, the skin, right? So here also you will find the same thing. In your syllabus there is another text, that is Dry September, the short story. There also you will find that the ultimate separatism and the violence that have been associated with this separatist politics, to be specific. He says therefore that it came, the Emancipation Proclamation, it came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. So ultimately, what was written in the Emancipation Proclamation, it is not continuing to be positively established. And that's why hundreds of years later, the Negro, their position, their existence, these were at stake. The Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation, separatism, and the chains of discrimination. So ultimately, these lines, these phrases, these are suggestive enough regarding the discrimination, regarding this separatism, regarding this violence, regarding this exploitation. Ultimately, you can identify them with a reference to the words, the manacles of segregation, the chains of discrimination, the typical crippling condition of the Negroes at the time. Each and every moment you will be well aware of the facts that was happening during the time of Martin Luther King. And if you browse the newspaper today, you will find the same thing is present at the present day America too. So ultimately, that separatist violence is always in work. You know that ultimately, if you think in terms of the international politics, if you think in terms of the national politics, obviously, you will find that the separatist violence, the typical kinds of separation and exploitation, sometimes on the basis of skin color, sometimes on the basis of caste, sometimes on the basis of gender, sometimes on the basis of race, sometimes on the basis of religion, and even the matters of provincialism. So everywhere you will find within the societies, though we are reading a particular American crisis, but can you say that it is simply a particular problem to America alone? No. You will find the similar kind of orientations, though something different. But ultimately, we are facing the same problems today also. In India, to be specific, you will find these separatist violences are always there. Okay? The exploitations, even murder. Okay? The extortions, always, the different kinds of things are there. So therefore, he says, 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty. Why such poverty? Is it simply referring to that financial crisis that they live? Or rather, it is something, indicating towards something symbolic. He says the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. So again, the difference. The difference is being aimed at. Okay, it is not the typical temperament of live and let live. Okay, rather you will find that somehow in the midst of material prosperity, America was prospering at the time. But if you think in terms of the blacks, in terms of the black Americans, in terms of the Negroes, you will find that somehow the Negroes were treated to be like the slaves. And that's why you will find that a typical differentiation is visible properly. He says, therefore, in a typical metaphoric and poetic language, he says, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American society. So marginalization, the typical center and margin crisis that we find in post-colonialism, that we find in feminism, that we find in Marxism, imperialism, everywhere you will find the same thing as in operation. He says 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of the American society and find himself an exile in his own land. So ultimately, there is something pathetic, In your own land, you can find as if you are an outsider, just like Camus' outsider, Albert Camus. So similarly, you will find that somehow as if you were completely being alienated. You are completely being made an outsider by the power politics itself. So that is being underscored here. So that is the sole reason. So ultimately in the first section, we have found that Martin Luther King is actually indicating towards the present scenario. In spite of the Emancipation Proclamation, in spite of the Gettysburg Address, and obviously, the diplomats and the politicians who have tried to bring justice, freedom, equality in America, what is the present scenario? Okay? And he is indicating to that in the first paragraph of this particular discussion. He says, so we have come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. What is the shameful condition that is being described here? And what is the other part, or what are the other parts to be specific? We will continue this in our next lectures. Stay attached. Thank you.